Again, for those of you who weren't here in the morning, my name is Matt Furchin. I'm a resident scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center in Beijing. Happy to be here again for this afternoon's discussion and continuation of some of the very interesting issues that were already brought up in the morning. Our panel this afternoon is titled Opportunities and Barriers for China's International Oil Collaborations. So we're going to be focusing on some of the international foreign policy dimensions of China's engagement surrounding oil globally. Joining me on the panel this afternoon are Kong Bo, sitting right to my left, and Andrew Weiss on the other side. Kong Bo is the ConocoPhillips Petroleum Professor of Chinese and Asian Studies and Assistant Professor at the University of Oklahoma's College of International Studies. Bo is an old friend and classmate of mine, actually, from way back in 2000 when we met at the Hopkins Nanjing Center, and we have maintained contact in the meantime, so it's great to have him here. Andrew Weiss is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research in Washington and Moscow on Russia and Eurasia. Before joining Carnegie, he also had spent time both at the RAND Corporation as well as in the government working on similar issues in these parts of the world. So it's great to have both of you. I'm going to hand it over to Kong Bo first, and then we'll move to Andrew, and I will follow after that.
Thank you, Matt, for your kind introduction. It's good to see you, and it's good to see you flourish academically and professionally. I always look up to you as a model when I try to figure out what I need to do next. Thank Debbie and David for inviting me to be part of this. It's a pleasure to be back after spending a year also in Norman, Oklahoma. I thought I would use my 15 minutes also to share with you some of my observations on opportunities and barriers in China's global oil collaborations. I would like to begin with three central statements. First, China has made some proactive responses to the shifting global oil paradigm. And these responses, in my view, have yielded quite a few noticeable improvements for China's energy security, in particular China's oil security. And that's my second point. And the third point is that these responses also have revealed uncertainties and risks for China's participation in the global oil industry. And so I'm going to use the rest of my time to walk you through my three-part argument. And first, let's take a quick look at China's responses to the shifting global oil landscape. And since 2008, we began to see really a paradigm shift emanating from North America, particularly thanks to the breakthrough of technologies. And China has been quite astute observer and made quite a few responses. You can group these responses in three categories, and one may call these responses the three arrows in Beijing's quiver. And the first response has to do with energy diplomacy, and the second response has to do with overseas direct investment, and the third response will be state financing. In a way, these three responses form the so-called iron triangle of China's global oil strategy, in my view. And let's take a look at energy diplomacy, or oil diplomacy per se. Since we are talking about oil, I wanted just to focus my remarks on this particular sector. Since Xi Jinping took office, he's been really quite active in promoting China's oil diplomacy wherever he goes, and he brings up energy issues when he goes to Africa, Central Asia, Russia, or Europe, when Premier Li Keqiang visits there. So energy diplomacy is very much part and parcel to the discussions these top leaders have with their counterparts when they travel overseas. Of course, energy diplomacy, oil diplomacy is not the sole part of it, but as I said, it's really part and parcel, and it's integral to what they discuss, particularly with respect to Russia. As I understand, my colleague will focus heavily on Russia, and I look forward to his remarks. And in that respect, I believe China has really been a beneficiary of this paradigm shift, if you think there's a paradigm shift. As I said, in these different categories. Oil energy diplomacy has yielded quite a few long-term contracts for China, and we are going to see a geographic shift in terms of where China sources its oil supplies. We begin to see that gradually already. If you look at where China sources its oil supplies right now, in comparison, I would like to make the comparison between 2013 and 2009. If you look at the data, what's clear is that China now imports more from Latin America, or so-called Western Hemisphere, and also Russia has become a major supplier of China's oil import as well. Middle East, of course, remains to be the dominant source of import. Meanwhile, Africa has declined a little bit in terms of importance for China, thanks to all the geopolitical dynamics and political uncertainties in that part of the world. So you begin to see China and Chinese oil companies shifting their geographical source of supply. And this has a lot to do, of course, this is connected to the second area of Beijing's quiver, that is overseas direct investment. The Chinese NOCs started to expand in the early 1990s. But in the 90s, I think one could characterize their overseas direct investment as relevant. And then enter into the 2000s, their investment started to expand. I think we could characterize that as stream. But after 2008, after the global financial crisis, boy, we really see a huge difference. Prior to 2008, the aggregate scale of total Chinese overseas direct investment in the oil and gas sector was normally below $10 billion. And then if you look at the data between 2008 and 2013, on the yearly basis, the total aggregate spending by the Chinese NOCs exceeded $10 billion easily. In one particular year, Chinese NOCs in total spent over $30 billion. And so since 2007 and 2013, Chinese NOCs collectively have spent at least over $130 billion. According to the recent IEA data between 2008 and 2011 and 2013, the Chinese NOCs, together with a number of other private companies, spent $73 billion. And what's interesting is that there is also a shift in terms of what the Chinese NOCs spend their money in. In the past, they always go after the conventional assets, and in particular, focusing on assets they are very familiar with at home. But since 2008, since the shale gas revolution, Chinese NOCs have ventured into North America and OECD countries. And of the $73 billion they spent between 2008, 2011, 2013, 1/3 goes to North America. And all of that 1/3, 90% goes into unconventional oil and gas. So we begin to see this really interesting shift. And Chinese companies, particularly Chinese NOCs, are obviously, if we infer from the data, very, very cognizant of the unconventional revolution, the shale gas revolution in the United States, in North America. They are cognizant of the resources at home. They want to tap into the know-how, both technological and managerial know-how. In North America, they want to bring that back to China. And of course, I will get back to whether they've been making progress in that regard. So in any case, we see this shift in terms of where they invest and what they invest. And of course, their shift to OECD countries and North America also reflects their concerns about political uncertainties and political risks in places like Africa, particularly Sudan and South Sudan. So the Chinese companies started to turn to more political stable areas that have lower political risks. And what's interesting is also that with this round of shale gas revolution, there is also a change in attitudes towards Chinese NOCs. In most places, particularly in OECD countries, most government officials have been quite relaxed with Chinese NOCs' acquisitions of their assets. Of course, you still have some concerns in Canada about Chinese NOCs' acquisitions, but by and large, they haven't encountered the type of opposition you witnessed in 2005 when CNOOC tried to acquire Unocal in the United States. And in fact, the Chinese NOCs, in my view, have really changed their strategies. They began to focus on minority acquisition. They began to focus on becoming minority stakeholders. So that's the second sort of pillar, or second sort of arrow. The third arrow has a lot to do with state financing, or the role of state-owned, state financial institutions. I call them SFIs. And between 2008 and 2013, collectively, we've seen the state-owned financial institutions investing at least over close to $100 billion. And I'm talking about the oil and gas sector in particular. And of course, a lot of this have to do with long-term contracts. And so in that regard, we should not be surprised that China will be importing more and more crude oil from Russia. China will be importing more natural gas from Russia and Central Asia. And I think with this second pillar, with this second thrust of effort, we're going to see China's gradual shift toward neighboring countries in terms of where it sources its supplies. And that's a deliberate strategy to reduce the country's dependency on the Middle East. And of course, as to whether that will succeed, that's a separate story. We'll come back to it and ask whether that will succeed and what the structural factors that will determine how far that effort can go. And so if you look at the three categories, and one should say that Chinese NOCs and Chinese government together have really made some rapid and proactive responses to the so-called paradigm shift. And in my view, these responses have enhanced China's energy security in three dimensions: the physical dimension, the access dimension, and institutional dimension. And let's look at the physical dimension. When I say physical dimension, I refer to the strategic reserves China is building up and the security margin China has. And in fact, as alluded to this point by Mike this morning, China has been taking advantage of this low oil prices by filling its strategic petroleum reserves. If you look at the import numbers, import has been up by 8%, and despite the Chinese economy is slowing down. So a lot of this purchase really goes into the SPRs. And so by all estimate, China has about 30 days of emergency stocks, and China is on schedule and on track to build a strategic petroleum reserves that last 100 days by 2020. And so I think for the first time, the Chinese seem to have concluded that their purchase will not raise oil prices that very high. And normally that's what happened when they ramp up their purchases. And so this time around, they really have acted really fast, acted very decisively. And so in that regard, the SPRs certainly have enhanced the physical dimension of China's energy security. But the message is really mixed. And China has been building more pipelines, to Myanmar, oil and gas pipeline, and then gas pipeline to Turkmenistan, Central Asia, and then ESPO pipelines operational. And recently, China and Russia agreed to build two more pipelines. One's the western route, or the other is the eastern route. As China builds more and more pipelines, China also exposes itself to risks associated with the security and security integrity of these pipelines, particularly in places like Myanmar, where the central government still doesn't have control in some parts of the country. And also terrorism risk is also a serious concern in some part of Central Asia. So China begins to expose itself to these risks. As is similar in the area of ODI, as Chinese NOCs increase their global footprint, they also expose themselves to all sorts of political risks on the ground. And that's why the Chinese government now is pulled into all these local conflicts in Sudan, in Nigeria, in other places, Libya, for example, right? And now let's look at the second dimension of China's energy security or oil security, access. ODI, Chinese overseas investment, overseas direct investment, has really enhanced the country's access to resources around the world. Now, Chinese oil companies invest over 40 countries. They have access to $2.5 billion, 2.5 million barrels of oil equivalent on a daily basis. That's half of the domestic production. That's also equivalent to the totality of Brazil's domestic supply. And this is also a huge improvement. And of course, not all 2.5 million barrels a day goes back to China, but that production goes to the international market. It adds to the global liquidity and upon which China depends. So in that sense, this certainly enhances the country's energy security as China feels more and more confident, more comfortable about its ability to operate internationally. I think it will be more and more relaxed about oil security. And what about the institutional dimension? I think there it's a very mixed bag. This morning, Professor Xi talked about domestic reforms. I think President Xi Jinping has launched a number of initiatives. He talked about revolution in China's energy sector, technology revolution, production revolution, consumption revolution, and governance revolution. I think these are all lofty, glorious goals, but implementing them and carrying them out actually is quite complicated, it's quite difficult. And in fact, as alluded to by Professor Xi this morning, in the gas sector, the progress has been very, very slow and protracted. Right? And I share the same view. And in fact, if you look at Chinese NOC's performance in shale gas, and one Chinese NOC was recently just fined by the Chinese government for not investing enough into shale, into the acreages it acquired. And not to mention that 80% of the acreage is in the hands of the 3 NOCs. Only 20% is up for grabs. And the bidding this far is only open to domestic players, right? Then you have all sorts of on-the-ground factors that complicate the ability of China to replicate the revolution you see in the United States. So the long and short of this, I'm not very optimistic about the speed at which China can replicate this revolution. And I think with respect to the government's agenda on governance reform or energy governance reform, I think I remain to be convinced that the government has made up its mind and knows exactly how to tackle energy governance reform. And the anti-corruption campaign targeting Chinese NOCs, particularly Chinese CNPC, raised some hopes about the possibility of the Chinese government reforming the overseas direct investment system, where a lot of corruption actually has occurred historically. I think we only touched the tip of the iceberg. Once you follow that thread, you're going to see a lot of corruption. And that brings me to my last set of comments about the challenge, the uncertainties and risks associated with China's participation in the global oil industry. With respect to overseas direct investment, I think for the first time we begin to see a slowdown, a notable slowdown by the Chinese NOCs in terms of their global acquisitions. Between 2007 and 2013, collectively, Chinese NOCs have accounted for 10% of the global mergers and acquisitions in the oil and gas industry. When you contrast this number to the total spending by Asian NOCs, all other Asian NOCs, excluding the Chinese NOCs, these Asian NOCs only account for 4%. That means Chinese NOCs have been spending at least 2 more times than their Asian peers, and particularly after the Asian financial crisis. And this is a sharp contrast with how the Chinese NOCs handled their overseas direct investment in the early 2000s and in the 1990s. And back then, I think Wood Mackenzie, a number of respectable institutions have pretty much arrived at the conclusion that Chinese NOCs actually make a pretty good profit. Their profit margin actually is pretty high. Their rate on equity is very good. But due to this aggressive spending since the since the global financial crisis in 2008, I think the Chinese NOCs have not been terribly prudent. As a result, their debt-to-asset ratio is very, very high. If you look at the debt-to-asset ratio of the 3 NOCs, and on average, their debt-to-asset ratio is in the range of 40-50 level. And moreover, the return on equity is also low, has dropped from 20% to 10% or even below 10%. So I think we are seeing a dramatic and noticeable slowdown by the Chinese NOCs this year. We're going to have the data very soon, and this is already noticeable based on the data I've looked at. However, this doesn't mean China will stop acquiring resources around the world. Instead, the Chinese private companies now have stepped up. Now that the Chinese government has begun to relax the control on the downstream sector, so the refined teapot refineries and private companies start to acquire resources around the world, particularly in Central Asia, and some even ventured into the United States. So we begin to see some the entry of some private players from China, and this is quite new. In the past, the oil industry is always dominated by the state-owned enterprises in China, and the glass door has never been broken. And I don't think the rumor that the CNPC or other Chinese NOCs will be broken into pieces is true. I don't think that has any validity. If you look at how President Xi Jinping talks about energy policy, talks about energy strategy, that certainly is not in the works. Nevertheless, China has made a lot of improvement in its energy security. We begin to see this in terms of the geographical source of its import and also where a Chinese NOCs acquire assets. And nevertheless, as I have argued in my presentation, that energy security begins at home. If I leave you with one thought, that is, if you ask yourself about what contributes to America's improved energy security over the last 10 years also, it's not due to the policy of the Obama administration. It's due to years of dedicated research in advanced technologies. It's due to the innovation. It's due to this rudimental capitalism that really has led to this shale gas revolution. In other words, what's above the ground really dictates whether China can replicate the type of energy revolution you've seen in the United States. In that regard, I think the proof is still in the pudding. The jury is out, and I think we need to see more on the ground. And thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Gongbo. A lot to think about, and we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. First, Andrew.
Great. No, thank you, Matt, and thank you to Debbie for putting together this terrific day of discussions. It's a bit nostalgic for me to be up here talking about global energy markets. I spent most of the aughts working as an energy and commodities analyst on the sell side, and it's a little bit like saying I was, analyzing the 8-track tape industry or something, given where global markets are today. But there is a sense of deja vu in terms of the volatility we're seeing in the markets in the last couple of weeks. And it makes me, again, just in the face of all that, just restate the need for humility about our predictive and analytical powers when there's so much systemic risk and also so much obvious uncertainty about where some of these big developments are going to take us. You have, in the global energy space, all the issues that the Kongbo's laid out with regard to China, but with regard to Russia, you are in the middle of a hurricane, geopolitical hurricane. And I think it's important to remember that it's not a tier 1 hurricane in the sense that It's not an issue that is dominating Western foreign policy decision-making. You might get that impression from the newspapers and from the press coverage of the Ukraine crisis. I think very much what we're seeing is a crisis which is now going to become deeply entrenched and immovable for the foreseeable future, and that's going to create a lot of distortions and a lot of unpredictability. So I'm going to talk about some of those in my remarks. I'll try to be really quick because I really very much want to hear what Matt has to say and then open this up for discussion. It's from all the interactions I have with the Russian government and analytical community, it's clear China is the flavor of the month. It dominates a lot of the public discourse and elite discourse, but it's far from clear if top-down imperatives will be translated into economically sustainable and meaningful cooperation over the long term. There's a lot of talk, but I think a real shortage of strategic analytical expertise on China in the Russian system, and they're just sort of trying to scramble to come up with things. The people who've been the first movers in this, particularly at the state oil company Rosneft, clearly have thought about this a lot. Gazprom has been obviously engaged in a very long-running negotiation with its Chinese partners. But for the rest of the system, this is all new. And you hear this anecdotally from people, both a sense of, wow, we're going to be eaten alive when we descend into these very competitive Asian markets. But also you hear a sense of, for my European business, I have dozens, if not hundreds, of contacts and people I know in my space. In Asia, I know one or two. And so there's kind of an asymmetry of knowledge, which I think will permeate a lot of the decision-making, and it does lead to the possibility of distortion and error. As I said at the outset, the confrontation between the West and Russia is unlikely to be ameliorated anytime soon, and it really creates a situation where we're all going to be hostage to events on the ground. And you could have a situation where, God forbid, there's humanitarian tragedies or other things that drive events in directions that even the great powers don't want to see occur. But there's just, as we had in the Balkans, a real high possibility for further loss of life, civilian suffering, and then that sort of drives Western policy responses, or by that token, Russian and Ukrainian policy responses, which could have significant long-term implications, including, as I'll come to in a minute, for the development of Russia's energy relationship with China. The crisis is aggravating a number of problems in the Russian system, which predated the Maidan revolution in Ukraine about a year ago today. But it's now clear that those phenomena are becoming more intense, and you just need to look at some of the headlines of the last couple of weeks about ruble volatility to get a sense of how significant all this may be. The Russian economic model that provided much of Putin's political popularity and a sense of great socioeconomic gains for the average Russian over the past decade is now petering out. It was fueled by a capex boom in commodities-fueled capex boom in China. That's now going to go away as China transitions, and I know there's a lot of people in this room who know more about that than I do, but as China transitions to a more normal economic development model. That model, though, created huge wealth in Russia, and I think it created a sense of global ambition, of the desire to make big strategic bets. And so China is now one of those strategic bets, and I'll come back to how it's being implemented in a second. At the same time, we've seen a near total, I think, collapse of investor confidence, both foreign and domestic. So as Russia goes out to implement some of these strategic goals, their ability to access Western capital markets or build sort of durable business goals and strategies is very much in question. We've seen a re-centralization and reassertion of government central control over the economy, particularly in the natural resources and strategic sectors, that creates perverse incentives and creates a lot of policy distortion. We've also seen huge, as everyone knows, structural shifts in global energy markets thanks to the shale revolution, thanks to the advent of LNG and increased spot pricing for natural gas. But all of these things, again, sort of put Russia in a wrong-footed position. They're not fatal, but they're quite significant in terms of how Russia develops in the future. There's a lot of uncertainty about where Russia's core energy markets are heading, given what's going on in the Eurozone, given what's happening in China. Russia, to much, is sort of the old adage I think is true, is it's a price taker, not a price maker. I think that's very much an important factor here as we delve into what it all will mean for Russia. There's, I think, also a big mismatch between some of the elites' expectations about an embrace from Asia, particularly in terms of accessing new sources of finance, and the reality. Russia, for most of the major financial players in Asia, is kind of a esoteric question. It's something that it's just not a cardinal topic. There are a couple state champions in China for whom this is a really big deal, but the idea that the gates have sort of swung open to Asia and that there's an eager audience waiting to dole out huge amounts of financing to Russian corporates, again, it's just not going to happen. And then finally, as the sort of core dysfunction of Russia today, investors look at things like respect for property rights. They see the forced nationalization of one of Russia's largest energy independent companies, Bashneft, in the past couple months, and they have to ask themselves, what kind of market is this? So again, that's the backdrop before we go into this. The energy stuff in more detail. The piece which I'm not sure people here are focused on is the sanctions regime. And so what we have in the Western sort of policy discourse about Russia is a sense that, well, we can't do much to roll back Russia's annexation of Crimea. We can't do much to kick Russia out of meddling in eastern Ukraine. But what we surely can do is retard the long-term development of Russia's oil and gas sector. And so the sanctions that have been implemented by the US and the EU are very much aimed at a time frame that sort of kicks in around 2018 to 2020. The three categories that the sanctions targeted the most were offshore development, deep offshore, the Arctic, and unconventional onshore. So how that applies to China isn't completely direct, but it signals a change in the atmosphere in Europe and in here about the licensing for various types of technology, which are going to be very important for the greenfield development, which is supposed to power these new oil fields that will eventually lead to shipments of hundreds of thousands of barrels per day to China. And it also has a potentially material effect on how the natural gas sector develops. And what we're headed for, and this is the sort of the big headline of the next week or so, is a possible congressional action in the form of new legislation known as the Corker-Menendez bill, which would create sort of blanket sanctions on the Russian energy sector and basically remove the executive branch's ability to go up and down. It would also drive a big wedge between the United States and Europe in terms of creating a permanent set of sanctions against Russia, whereas the European sanctions are time limited and will sort of roll off, or at least can be lifted in stages over the coming months. The Putin that we dealt with in the first 15 years of his tenure is very different than the Putin one sees in action today. We have a bunkered war president today who really hasn't focused on big strategic energy questions the way he did in the first 15 years of his presidency. The idea that calibrating and strategizing and reprioritizing the Russian economy or Russian energy sector, which used to really animate him, it's now not the case. He's very much focused on the war. He very much sees himself as in an existential struggle with the West. He believes that these sanctions efforts are aimed largely at promoting his ouster, of driving wedges between him and the Russian elite, between him and the Russian people. And so for him, that is sort of existential, absolutely essential. Dealing with a lagging economy, dealing with the currency crisis, dealing with long-term pivot toward Asia, all that is interesting and important. But it's not, again, it's in terms of the bandwidth there, it's not getting the same attention it would have in a more benign political environment. But at the same time, there are these paradoxical side effects, which is that given the need to show that Russia is not isolated, that the sanctions haven't had an effect, you see a desire to really do deals with China and do them quickly and in scale. And so the most vivid example of that is the visit President Putin made to Beijing in May 2014, in which he announced that this long-running discussion on natural gas sales to China had been concluded, and we have a deal that's for a 38 BCM deal, which seems, at least in terms of the pricing, which although those details haven't been released, seems to have been basically speeded up, or longstanding Russian positions were basically shelved at the last minute to give Putin this big political victory and sort of image that Russia's not isolated and that China is its new strategic partner. As the Russian economy slows down and the government has fewer resources, that's going to put, I think, some pressure on the taxation regime. I assume folks here are familiar, but basically greenfield projects in Russia have been disadvantaged in terms of a very confiscatory tax policy, which made it disadvantageous for companies to pursue greenfield projects. In the last couple of weeks, the Duma has enacted what's called the tax maneuver, which will basically make refining bear more of the tax burden and greenfields less of the tax burden, But as the Russian economy continues to grind down, the question will be how durable those changes are and whether people will go back and try to soak oil companies for more of the revenue that the state needs. 50% of Russia's state budget comes out of the oil and gas sector. The irony here is that a lot of the projects and the gearing of Russian oil companies to the oil price is actually less sensitive than you would expect, given that the state has been harvesting and creaming off most of the spike in oil prices as oil climbed above $100. So it's going to be interesting because the IRRs for a lot of the greenfield projects are somewhat challenged. So it'll be interesting to see as the economy gets softer, as the state gets more keen to find new sources of revenue, if some of these tax changes change. And those could have extremely important impacts in terms of delaying the timeline for building some of these new fields that Rosneft is developing in cooperation with CNPC and other Chinese partners. There's no doubt that the embrace of the Chinese oil market is a strategic bet for Rosneft. That dates back to 2009 and the 20-year contract that was signed between Rosneft and Chinese partners to put about 30,000 barrels a day into the Chinese market through the Eastern Siberian Pacific pipeline. What's happened now, though, is you've seen barriers and boundaries and sensitivity points that the Russians had been respecting. Those are now being leapfrogged over. And there's a sort of pattern which, again, I think gives certain people in the Russian elite a measure of disquiet. If you look at what's happened, for example, until now, the Russians have been very wary of granting the Chinese equity stakes in major strategic industries, let alone major oil industry fields. In September, there's reports that Putin has offered a Chinese partner who I believe has not been specified upwards of 10% stake in the Vancor field, which is owned by Rosneft. So again, we're seeing new norms and new behaviors in response to a strategic imperative to develop relations with China. The other issue, which I think is quite fortunate for Rosneft, is the advent of these prepayment deals, where you have upwards, for example, for the deal with CNPC that was announced in 2013, upwards of $65 to $70 billion in prepayment, where, particularly for Rosneft, which has swallowed up what was once one of Russia's private companies, TNK-BP, it's taken on a huge debt burden. And so these prepayments from its Chinese partners are going to basically ameliorate the debt service on those that Gazprom is facing in 2014 and 2015, especially given that they don't have the ability to roll over or restructure that debt as Western capital markets close to Russia. Finally, a couple words about gas, and then I'll close. That is where I think, if you look at where Russia's got potentially the greatest advantage, will be based on its geographical proximity, based on those types of fields that are available in eastern Siberia, potentially the greatest promise for developing a serious and lasting collaborative relationship with Chinese partners. The deal that was struck in Beijing in May 2014, I think, is an important stepping stone. And the idea that that Russia can live with basically equivalence between European netbacks and Chinese or Asian market netbacks really sort of, I think, changes some of the dynamic for the long term. And so we could see, there's rumors of a second pipeline deal that's under discussion between the Russians and the Chinese. But again, you could see Russian aggressive pricing moves that start to affect the economics of other LNG projects that China has been looking at in the recent past. In closing, I guess my final caution to everyone is just how uncertain the Russian domestic outlook is, and for us to sort of expect that all of these plans can be executed in an environment where every day, we're all hostage to some development in eastern Ukraine makes me very cautious. And so, anyways, with that, I'll turn things back to Matt.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. It's a good segue to a few things that I'm going to say about Venezuela. If there's one other place that's even as much in a sort of kind of a hurricane or facing a variety of problems, especially on the decreasing oil price, it's Venezuela. But those Russia and Venezuela are often mentioned in the same sentence when it comes to that. So thank you very much. So my presentation is going to focus on China, oil, and the Americas, with a lot of focus within that on China and Venezuela relations. I'm going to divide this discussion into three components, talk just a little bit more about some things we've already heard a little bit about in terms of the background changes in China itself that are motivating some of the ways that it's changing its global stance and approach to energy and oil in particular, and then talk about the specific case of China and Venezuela, where that's headed, and then sort of what this means more broadly for China, U.S., and the Americas on issues of climate change and energy security issues. So let me begin by saying a few words about changes on the domestic front in China. I think there's an interesting way in which there is both a vision for reform, which has been out there for a while in China, going back to the previous administration, about where the country needed to head in terms of a new development model, relying less on exports, less on government financing, less on heavy industry. And this has obviously been emphasized as a key part of the new government's own agenda for reform. At the same time, I think there's an important element of, if not crisis, a kind of new urgency which has been thrust on the government to do something in terms of the air quality, in terms of climate, and in terms of energy security. Comboil was just telling us about a variety of ways in which China, he sees the improvements on energy security through a variety of activities. But I think both on the home front and the international front, when it comes to energy security and also some of the issues related to energy use domestically and climate change, I think there is both a vision of reform that's been out there that's sort of forward-thinking, and also one of, we better do something or else. So it's a bit reactive as well. And the tension between those two, I think, is important to point out. So when we hear about Xi Jinping and the idea of an energy revolution, that's a wish as much as anything. And the feeling is, if this doesn't happen, if these reforms don't happen, the problems will be greater. And in terms of energy security, if you don't do something now, the rising reliance on foreign imports of oil, this kind of thing can become a greater source of tension or worry. So I think this is an important thing to think about, what's going on with China and its sort of the proposed reforms across a dimension of issues related to energy ultimately. I also think it's interesting to keep in mind that the downturn in China's energy, or the downturn in China's economic growth, combined with this plan for economic reform, has influenced global commodity markets well beyond just oil, and even more so in other areas like iron ore, for sure, copper, soybeans, across a variety of dimensions. And there's a very interesting foreign policy challenge for China, especially as it's related to developing countries. China has promoted as a core part of its foreign policy with developing countries a sort of South-South strategy, and a lot of that has relied on this idea that China needs natural resources to the extent that some developing countries have those natural resources. They get together, they trade, it's good for everyone's development, and this leads to harmonious, peaceful, great outcomes for everyone. That was when demand was high and prices were high. So oil is just one of these areas where those prices are going down, probably good for China in a lot of ways, maybe not so good for some of its developing country partners, namely Venezuela, but others as well. And then if you look at Brazil and iron ore, and Chile and copper, and across other dimensions, this becomes a foreign policy challenge, I think, for China, as this trend is potentially good for China, not so good for others. So I want to move with that into thinking about some of the issues of China's relations with Venezuela. So I think that this relationship between China and Venezuela on energy and oil in particular, it is the most interesting relationship that China has with any country in this hemisphere. on the issue, again, of energy and oil. In part, this is because Venezuela is special in certain ways, but also the way China has decided to approach Venezuela has been special. So how is Venezuela special? Venezuela is special in terms of its overall oil resources. It has more oil resources than any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. It's only the 9th largest producer, so there's a gap there. But in terms of the size of Venezuela's oil resources, it's unparalleled. So that is important. When Hugo Chavez was president, his approach to domestic and foreign policy was also unique in the region of Latin America, but also the way that he governed the energy sector and the oil sector in particular was, and then a variety of problems that were already apparent, sort of social tensions, a variety of economic problems that were out there even when Hugo Chavez was alive. Those have clearly become more extreme since he became ill and then died, and under the new president, Nicolas Maduro. So Venezuela's got this interesting combination of a very large resource base, a sort of a unique approach to political, social, and economic governance within Venezuela itself, and then this whole variety of problems that have been deepening over the years and only exacerbated now with the drop in oil prices. China's approach to Venezuela has also been relatively unique. China has gone in with the China Development Bank in particular on a scale through state-to-state lending in a way that it has done nowhere else, not only in the Americas, but in the world. And I think this was a sort of perfect storm in a way where the sort of open door, the willingness of Hugo Chavez to want to cooperate with China to move its exports away from a reliance on the United States sort of overlapped with China Development Bank in particular, wishing to push into the Americas, and signals being sent that everything would be fine as long as the go-ahead was there and the high-level approval was there from Chavez. And so I think this sort of dynamics on both sides led to this huge ramping up in the scale and the type of relations that existed between Caracas and Beijing. There have been a variety of problems in the relationship, even as they sort of moved into a deepening relationship on both sides. A lot of this has to do with Venezuela's own challenges in terms of oil production and also the limits that they placed on foreign investors, including the Chinese. These issues have been apparent on the Chinese side for a while in terms of the actual promised flows of oil, which have never met expectations, according to officials on both sides, and also direct investment opportunities, especially in the Orinoco region. So Chinese companies have been very interested, hoping to get more access. That access has continued to be limited. Jump forward to today. These problems had been out there for a while. Now, with the dropping price of oil, deepening problems in Venezuela itself, China finds itself in a very tricky situation where it is the major source of foreign finance for Venezuela. It still has a high amount of the debt that it provided, the loans that it provided to Venezuela. Still unclear how much of that's been paid back. Questions about whether or not the debt repayment has been rescheduled or not. But the one thing we certainly know is the situation facing the Venezuelan government in terms of oil and its own revenue stream is becoming more and more difficult. And there is a way in which the Venezuelan authorities look to China for an answer here. And this puts China in a very tricky situation given its policy about non-interference. Because one way or the other, whether China agrees to provide more finance or doesn't agree to provide more finance, it's making a decision that will affect Venezuelan politics. And so this sort of is a challenge that is, it sort of goes beyond the framework of non-interference. You have to make a decision. You already have big influence, so what you decide to do will have an impact. And so last week, Nicolas Maduro mentioned that he would be sending a delegation to Beijing to talk about more financing. So what does the decision on that end up being from the Chinese side? And then the one issue that is really not discussed very much on the Chinese side in relation to Venezuela and its oil, there are lots of discussions about the political risk scenario and repayment of the debts. There's very little discussion about the quality of oil, the extra heavy oil that Venezuela has. So what if China gets more of what it wants? What if it gets more Venezuelan oil? How does that then, both on the import and the refining side, how does that line up with China's goals of combating climate change, air pollution issues? And so as we heard about in the earlier panel today, these are very practical questions about how best to make use of those extra heavy resources there. So on the sort of geopolitical end of this, as well as then on the sort of very practical question of how do you use Venezuelan oil once you have it, China faces some very real challenges. I think there's a lot of discussion again on the sort of the political risk side of it, a lot less discussion and on the use of the oil and the effects on climate change, and those need to happen. Let me make a few concluding comments then before we open it up to discussion about how I think this sort of matters for the U.S. and China as they move forward on this broader question of climate and energy cooperation. I think Venezuela actually presents Venezuela and extra heavy oil, which is not just in Venezuela, also clearly the oil sands in Canada, and the way that those are sort of integrated in a sort of very rapidly changing and diversifying energy scheme throughout North America, but also the Americas in general. I think there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation here in setting a new agenda for how the United States and China can think together on very practical issues related to the best practice for getting these extra heavy oils out of the ground, transporting them and refining them, how each of the countries will choose to use these, what will be the impacts on the countries that are producing them. And obviously Venezuela is the one case now where there is a possibility where this crisis could lead to a rethinking about foreign participation in the country, but also sort of what's the best use of the extra heavy oil, especially in the Orinoco, where a lot of these resources are yet to be developed. And if we think that there is a sort of concern and upswell of activism around the development of the oil sands in Canada, imagine what this is going to be like in the Orinoco. So you're basically talking about the Amazon, where we have yet to have much of a discussion about how this is going to work. So I think there's a way in which the U.S. and China can think more about this. And then the other dimension of this is how do the U.S. and China think about cooperating and what energy security means in unstable or changing countries in their backyards. So Venezuela is one of these, Myanmar is another. And since there is shared interest and concern about energy security, about the flow of energy, and also to some extent about what good governance means in these countries, I think there is an opening here for more discussion about how both the energy resources can be used, but also sort of how that can lead to potentially more stable outcomes within the countries themselves. And so this is obviously a very tricky case in Venezuela. This is mostly up to the people of Venezuela themselves. But to the extent that other countries have a major impact on what happens in terms of the major energy sources from those places, there will be a way in which the U.S. and China have an impact, and I think more discussion, more openness about how best to do that on a climate dimension and also in terms of political stability make a lot of sense. So I'm going to close with that and open it up to discussion and questions. So why don't we go ahead and start with taking 2 or 3 questions for the panel, and then we'll get some responses and see how our timing works out. Professor Xu up front, we'll start with you. Is it on?
Wait. Okay. So, Chinese. So I came here. Then Chinese try to make it clear because there are so many saying about the oil paradigm shift, but to which direction? What the main characteristics of the new oil paradigm? Because there are various different saying about new oil order and also new energy era. Because U.S. and China try to find the common interest for collaboration in the future. That if in the understanding we don't have the same understanding, so how can we have the further collaboration? So do we have the same understanding of the shift? So shift to where? And how will this shift last? So that is what Chinese very interested in. So I beg your pardon to give me some clear information, because today our main thing is about the oil paradigm shift. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Do we have another question or two before we answer that? Over here.
Hi, I'm Zhang Yuan with Caixin Media. I have a question for Kong Bo. You mentioned that Chinese private companies stepped up. What kind of challenges or barriers they might encounter in the U.S.? Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Yeah, sure.
Lawrence Cope. In the current market, oil is very economic, yet Venezuela's production costs are some of the highest in the world. Would you think that China might be inclined to purchase supplies in the world market at this time and defer purchases in Venezuela, or continue the development of infrastructure in that country? And also, do you see any possible funding for widening and expanding the Panama Canal to facilitate shipment of oil and possible iron ore from Brazil?
All right, great. Let's go ahead and start with that. Kongboy, maybe you want to take 1 or 2 of those.
Well, I'll try. The paradigm shift, I think, is very much interpretive. There's no consensus on what this paradigm shift means for different countries in the global energy market. As far as China is concerned, and as far as the United States is concerned, certainly the markets, as far as demand and supply is concerned, the markets are shifting back in the favor of consumer countries. And so for the first time, OPEC has lost some power over the market. In that regard, I think you have quite a few analysts that have always questioned the influence of OPEC over supply. Some, for example, will argue that OPEC has never had much influence. The influence of OPEC as a cartel is really an emperor's clothes. And so it's not OPEC that has much influence. It's Saudi Arabia that has always served as the central bank of the global oil market, right? It's the last resort of the global oil supply. I think in that regard, Saudi Arabia still plays a pivotal role. And if you look at the projections into global supply and demand, the shale gas revolution in the United States and also the attendant discussions about the U.S. becoming self-sufficient or independent obscure the important fact that this increase in self-supply is actually very brave beyond 2030, I think the U.S. will again become dependent upon the global energy market. Even throughout this period of time, the U.S. will continue to import crude oil from different parts of the world. And so that's why I always sort of use the so-called paradigm shift, because it's always, the beauty is always in the eyes of the beholder. Different stakeholders understand the shift differently. You can't say what the shift means for the United States is the same for China. China has different energy mix, different energy resource base, and different energy posture. And therefore, it has to figure out its own path for energy security. And I think in many respects, in my view, as far as oil is concerned, China is getting better. China has improved its oil security over the past decade or so. And certainly it's not where it needs to be. The U.S. is not where it needs to be either in that regard. Energy policy has so many different policy threads and so many different equities. So arriving at policy coherence is very, very difficult. It involves trade-offs, it involves winners and losers. So in that regard, I'm not sure we're going to establish any consensus on what the paradigm shift entails, what it means for different players in the system. But what I can say is that the shift, this growing abundance of supplies, thanks to technological breakthroughs, does prompt us to have a different understanding of what resources are. How much there is underground. I think, with this round of shale gas revolution, there's no more discussion about peak oil. We began to have more nuanced understanding of different grades of crude, different types of oil underground. So in that regard, this growing supply certainly helps to relax the market. It certainly helps to generate the politics of abundance rather than the politics of scarcity, particularly as far as the consumers are concerned. But it creates a different set of problems for producer countries, as Andrew has just alluded to. So again, from producers countries' point of view, the shift may not be a good thing, right? If there is a shift. Challenges for private oil companies, private Chinese companies, I think the challenge is abundant. It has taken the Chinese NOCs over 2 decades also to learn how to play the rules of the market to compete all over the world. For many years, the Chinese NOCs have always shied away from competing head-to-head with IOCs. And even today, I should say that the Chinese NOCs have yet to catch up in key areas such as ultra deep water, and ultra deep water, now LNG projects and unconventional technologies. Right? Chinese NOCs are very much behind their IOC peers. And so if the Chinese private companies venture into these areas, and chances are they will bump into a very, very steep learning curve. But at the same time, the domestic upstream sector is not open. There is no sign that the Chinese government under this administration will open that up. To the extent that the shale gas sector has been opened, as I said, there is a question about the quality of assets that have been opened to bidding, and even a private company can participate in the upstream development. Access to pipelines remains to be an issue, right? And then there are other regulatory challenges that simply disadvantage these private companies. So in any case, I think that the private companies are going to bump into a lot of challenges: financing, experience, know-how, and managerial, and understanding of regulatory systems in different parts of the world. And the Chinese NOCs have learned that very, very hard in a hard way, right? I mean, when they go to many countries in Latin America, sometimes they bring their own labor, bring their own workers. That has created a lot of backlash in Africa, in many countries in Latin America. I think if the Chinese private companies want to play a role or want to grow their footprint across the world, they have to be able to handle those challenges. I'm not sure they will be, but it's going to take time, and we'll come back and revisit that issue.
Andrew, do you have any follow-ups on either of those? Just a quick thought on the paradigm shift, and then on Venezuela. But my sense of this, at least the approach that I was looking at it from, especially in working on the Venezuela case, is I think when a lot of people that I'm speaking to in China are focused on the shale revolution in the United States and the effect that that's having on U.S. energy markets and sense of energy security, and the fact that this isn't happening in China and what can be done about that. And then when I look at the sort of energy and oil markets in the Americas more generally, and in particular Venezuela, but then also Canada, and you see the sort of opposite end in terms of the type of oil that Debbie was talking about earlier. You have these extra heavy oils that are sort of the opposite of the shale oils that are being developed. And so it seems to me that, at least from the Chinese perspective, when engaging with Venezuela or Canada and thinking about, okay, so there are new energy or there are major energy resources online in this part of the world, but they're very different. And so that's part of the paradigm shift from my perspective. And interestingly, if we're talking about changes, the issue both in Venezuela and we talked earlier about Sudan, in a way, these are legacy issues. These were decisions that were made previously, maybe during an earlier stage of learning or something, and they're still there. So China's living with the consequences right now of decisions that were made 10, 15 years ago about how to approach a place like Venezuela. So that's a very interesting thing. Even if they've improved, they're still living with some of the outcomes of decisions that were made previously. In terms of China's approach, like what does it do in thinking about Venezuela right now? I think the tendency, I think the inclination might be to say, okay, they're in a weak position. Now we can get better terms, we can get more access to oil, but I think at the same time there have to be alarm bells going off saying, we can sign contracts, we can make deals right now to get more Venezuelan oil, or we can provide new sources of funding. And if you don't do it, maybe this puts Venezuela in such a difficult situation that there's, it raises the possibility of them not being able to pay back some of the previous loans. But if you do it, do you have any guarantee whatsoever that you're either going to get the oil or any of the loans that are, that you've just given afresh? So I think of the question, we're just going to have to watch and see what decisions are made. I think there's going to be pressure on both sides. So unfortunately, we are, I think, out of time in this session. So I think that we'll go ahead and close the discussion for right now. And hopefully for those of us, at least on the panel, I welcome you to continue discussions afterwards or to get our contact information. And I encourage you to please stick around for our final panel with Robert Hormats and Jessica Matthews. So thank you very much for coming.